So welcome to this fourth video of this series on conducting a successful scoping review project. We're going to close off the loop today and talk a bit about this last but not least important step, which will be to summarize the evidence that you found and to report those findings in a final review. I'd like to start this presentation off with this sort of idea here of the conclusions that you will draw as part of your scoping review will depend on the quality of the data extracted from the included studies. So we've talked about a lot of different steps being important along the way. Obviously, this part is also important. Not only is identifying the sources at the onset, finding those studies, then screening them, evaluating them through the title and abstract, and then also the full text. And now at this point, being able to draw information from those included studies to present the state of the literature. So let's remember one of the goals of a scoping review was to identify the extent of the literature on a certain topic. And now at this point, we want to be able to gather enough information from the included studies to say, well, this is the state of the literature at this point. And we'll walk through different steps along the way to getting to that point. We'll talk about what type of data we want to gather or collect at this point. One way of doing that is through the use of a data extraction form. I'll show you one example today in this video, and also to present results in a table format. What also is interesting at this point is not just showing what's out there, but to be able to identify certain themes, trends, and also to identify gaps in the literature that might warrant future research. Producing a narrative synthesis is also part of a scoping review's mandate. And to do that, you would want to turn also in terms of producing your final review, looking at reporting guidelines. And we'll talk today about the Prisma extension for scoping reviews. And lastly, but not the least important, is how do you disseminate the findings of your review through different channels. A lot of this presentation is based on this 2023 article that came out that talks about recommendations for extracting, analyzing, and presenting results in the context of a scoping review. And this was a key paper because up until that point, there was a bit of information in the methodological guidelines as to what to do in terms of extraction. If you turn back to the Arksey and O'Malley study from guideline from 2005, sorry. If you go back all that way, you'll look at they use the term charting data as part of the process of a scoping review. And there wasn't much in terms of guidance as to how to actually do that. So this article from 2023, the Pollock and Company article, really goes beyond that and provides some good basis on what to do in terms of extracting data, analyzing it, and presenting it in the context, again, of scoping reviews. So definitely a timely article, one that you probably would want to look at if you want to learn more beyond this presentation. So one of the key points, obviously, in terms of reporting findings from a scoping review is to collect pertinent data. So there's an important distinction between systematic reviews and scoping reviews in terms of what is presented. One thing I'm going to repeat a few times in this video is the fact that guidance for extracting data in the context of a scoping review tend to recommend that we do not extract results, but rather present information about the studies that have been conducted and general conclusions, but we don't have to go to the granular level that a systematic review would in terms of numbers and statistics and data. We're not necessarily, as I've mentioned before, comparing different study designs in the context of a scoping review. So you might have a mix of studies, a mix of reports, a mix of documents to work with. So the idea is to just present that. You can present statistics and data very succinctly in the context of a scoping review, but it's very hard to wrap our head around the fact that we shouldn't be extracting results or raw data from the individual studies that we've found in the context of a scoping review. And so again, as I mentioned, there's a bit of a lack of guidance in terms of what exists for charting data in the context of scoping reviews. So in that way, we're going to use that article and hopefully look at these three different steps. We want to extract data, we want to analyze it, and we want to present those data points. And so we're going to look at those individually throughout this video. How can we do that? We can turn to forms and tables as a way to structure how we extract data from different studies. As a guiding point for all of this is to go back to your reviews questions. What are you seeking to find as part of this scoping review? And that will help inform how you structure and design your extraction form. Also, what's important to remember is to provide a description, if you can, for some elements that might be harder or trickier for a group of data extractors to understand. So, if you're working in a team setting, providing a description of what's needed for the different fields might be helpful in the context of the form that you develop. If you can, turn back to the PCC framework or any other framework that you've used. So if we go back to that example of the PCC framework, trying to find information that relates to the population, to the context, and also to the concepts that you have or that you're hoping to get out of your scoping review. Test the form. It's very tricky, having been on teams myself, to do data extraction when some of the data that needs to be extracted might be a bit more difficult to find in the context of an article. And so when you have your study, you're looking for different pieces. Some of them are very easy to fill out: the title, the year of publication, the study design. But then the nuances related to a review question can be trickier to find. And so testing the form, having discussions about what data should be extracted can help, and you can refine that form based on that initial pilot test that you might want to do with 2 or 3 studies. So that's an important part as well. If you can, best practice recommends that extraction be done with at least 2 people. Now, this again is trickier because it depends on how many included studies you have. If you have a dozen, that's not too much of a problem to do. However, if you're in the 50s or even 100 articles that might be included in your final review, it's maybe trickier and more time consuming to extract data with 2 people per study. What you can do, however, is have one person extract and maybe another person that verifies. And that's flexibility that you can set up in tools like Covidence as well. Here's an example of a data extraction template in Covidence. Covidence has this built-in capability for you to do data extraction within the tool itself. A lot of people traditionally have done data extraction with Excel or Google Sheets or other spreadsheets or tables. But you can set it up in Covidence, and the advantage of doing that there is that you have the full text already. So you can extract, have the full text displayed on the screen, and then use the form on the right-hand side to fill in. This is a screenshot of the data extraction template. And as you can see, in the center column, you have the editor view. So these are the different fields that you can add. So you can structure your form with headers. You can include open-ended questions. You can also have close-ended questions that can be single choice or multiple choice. And you can also build in tables within the data extraction form itself. So there's a bit of flexibility in terms of how you lay out your data extraction form. On the right-hand side, you sort of see a preview of what that form would look like in the context of using it in Covidence. And you can modify all of this information. You can change the headers. You can add descriptions. You can change the question format. These are all things you can do as you sort of design the form, test it out, finalize it, and then launch into full data extraction in the tool itself. As with other parameters that you've set up in Covidence, you can set up how many reviewers are required for data extraction. So you can change that default from 2 to 1, and you can have these studies completed, because once you extract data, the form needs to then be completed by either the same person or another person. So that's where, if you can only have one reviewer do the data extraction per study, you can have a second pair of eyes to sort of go through and complete that extraction before it's officially finalized in the system. Here's another example that comes from the Pollock article, actually. They just show a general table model with some accompanying guidance. So these would be points of interest or descriptions of what is meant for each field. So if we look at, for instance, how the date where data were collected, that is information that's provided. So you can provide a range or information about the time required to collect data. So again, this is just an example that can be used to sort of plot out how you want to organize your data extraction form. Now, in addition to forms, you can also create tables at the very end. So once you're ready to produce your final review, you can integrate tables. This is one example taken from one of the studies that we've looked at in previous videos, around the effect of small class size, on academic achievement, you can see here an example of a very simple table that's used in the article to highlight the country, the time period, the grade level, the study design, more information about the class size, the number of students, and also the number of classes. And so it's very quick information that readers can digest around what's been already done on a specific question. Once the data extraction is complete, what you'll then want to do based on the more open-ended questions you might have in your form, start to think about themes or trends that you identify, but also notice any limitations or gaps that can emerge from the literature. And again, if we go back to one of the goals of a scoping review is to identify some of those gaps that might lead to future research. So taking the opportunity at this stage to sort of identify those could be a helpful step as well for guiding future research. A reminder again, this is maybe the second or third time that I've mentioned this, try not to extract results. There's no critical appraisal that takes place in the context of a scoping review, again, because we have a mixed bag of study designs or even of document types. And so critical appraisal becomes difficult because we can't use one form or one data extraction, or one critical appraisal tool to critically appraise all of the studies uniformly. So doing that is sort of an optional step in the context of a scoping review. If you can use descriptive statistics along the way for certain items, we've seen that in some of the examples. So you can basically say 25% of the studies were done in Canada versus 50% in the US and 25% in Europe. So you can have that information around certain elements of the studies that are included. That's definitely helpful for your reader. What you want to do afterwards, which is trickier as well, is to identify those themes but present them in a narrative fashion. So try to group your ideas together based on what you've observed through the studies that you've included in your study, and show any of those themes as they emerge across those included studies. Afterwards, you can, again, as I mentioned already, present some of the gaps and limits and suggest future paths for research. Now, in the Pollock article, they mentioned this step of doing content analysis as being optional. So if you're interested, you can do a content analysis of the included studies. They present two models. So this is very, for those of you who might have done qualitative research, this might be meaningful in terms of the inductive or the deductive approach to content analysis. Now, if you're following the inductive approach, it's basically doing an initial reading, gathering your ideas, and categorizing those studies into different groups, and then presenting a model based on your analysis of your reading of the literature. So the model sort of emerges after you've done the content analysis. In the deductive approach, you sort of have a pre-selected idea or a model that you already have, and you want to test out if it applies to the data set that you've gathered as part of your review. So you're looking to see if the model fits the data that you've collected. And so you can have, however, in the deductive approach, a step where you're revising and you're looking at what the literature has to say, and then there's a flexibility for changing that. So although you had an initial idea of this is what the literature would probably tell you, if there are changes that emerge out of the deductive approach, you sort of present that at the end. There's a bit more context provided in the article, but I did feel it was important to sort of just present this approach for content analysis as something that might be possible. Now, once you've done all of that step of identifying themes, you then want to sort of produce a narrative synthesis. And in order to do that, you're basically going to summarize extracted data from your evidence. What are the key points that you want to present? And essentially, not necessarily draw conclusions, but state this in an objective way, which is difficult to do, again, because we have a tendency to say, okay, well, these are the 5 studies that are there included. This is what they show. Now, you can present that in an objective way without necessarily saying that it's effective or not, or that there's certain nuances to create or to come up with in terms of some of the conclusions that the individual studies have presented. So keeping an objective view of the literature can help at that point when you're thinking of how to produce your synthesis. This idea of themes will carry across as well in the context of a scoping review. So, grouping the studies along different ideas based on the findings that emerge. And always remembering what are your review questions. We often tend to maybe forget them along the way. And I've sort of brought that idea back at different stages, whether it's the selection of the eligibility criteria, the exclusion criteria, but also for data extraction. Keep in mind, what are your goals? What are the objectives of the review? Once all of that's done, you want to turn to reporting guidelines to help you structure the final review itself. And we've talked about different things along the way in this series in terms of methodological guidance, but also reporting guidelines. And there's an important distinction to make. I have often seen published reviews, whether systematic or scoping or other types, that refer to Prisma as their methods. And Prisma is not a methodological guideline, it's a reporting guideline. So whenever you see that at the top of a methods section, you can see that as a red flag and wonder if their review is actually solid. So do not cite Prisma as your methodological guideline. Cite ArcSci and O'Malley or the update that was done in 2021, or even the Pollock article for data extraction. You can use those as methodological guidelines, but not necessarily as reporting guidelines. You can say that your review is structured according to Prisma. That makes total sense, but not as a guidance for your methods. So having said that, Prisma stands for the preferred reporting of items in a systematic review or meta-analysis. That's originally the model that came out. And then different extensions have been developed over time for different types of reviews. So certain nuances for different types of reviews. So there is an extension, which is called the Prisma SCR for scoping reviews. It's a 22-item checklist that basically highlights the different points that your final review should include. It provides guidance alongside examples to structure and format that final review. It's also strongly recommended that you include a completed checklist as part of your publication. So either as an appendix or a supplementary file, you would include the completed checklist stating that you've followed Prisma SCR and that you've done all the steps included, or that your final review includes all of the items from that checklist. We'll talk a bit about the Prisma diagram in a moment as a complement or as a part of the final review as well. There is also a Prisma extension for searching. So as librarians, we usually turn to Prisma Search to help structure how we present information around how the sources were gathered, which databases were used, etc. So if you're working on a review without including a librarian, you can turn to the Prisma Search for guidance on how to set up that section of your final review. You can link out to the scoping review extension on the Prisma website if you need to learn more about it. In a nutshell, here are the 22 items that you'll find in that checklist for Prisma scoping reviews. So obviously, we're not going to go through all of these, but quickly, they pretty much are self-explanatory, from the title to the rationale to whether or not you produced a protocol and registered it. What are your eligibility criteria? Which information sources did you use? How did you search those sources? How did you select the evidence? How did you chart the data? And then on the second column here, if you did any critical appraisal, is there a synthesis of those results? And you're going to see critical appraisal and results of sources and synthesis of results appear twice on that right-hand column. That's not an error. There are different sections and nuances to those syntheses, which are explained in the checklist. So some of them relate to the results and then some of the interpretation of those results. And lastly, any limitations or conclusions, as well as sources of funding for your review. Now, you've probably seen a Prisma diagram before if you've looked at any type of review, whether it's systematic or a scoping. And essentially, this is sort of a workflow of how you got from your initial set of results to the end with your included studies. So quickly working through this example here, we can see at the identification phase at the top of the diagram, you have a list of the databases that were used and how many results were gathered through those databases. There was also a second step that was done through citation searching and gray literature. They only found one additional article through citation searching. That box, by the way, on the right-hand side, upper right, can appear elsewhere in the diagram. Sometimes it's included more at the end because it's where that citation searching might happen. But here in this example, they've put that at the top. Then it talks about how many references were removed using either duplication identification manually or through covidence. Then it gives you a set in the center of the screen where you're seeing how many studies were screened. So here we see that 2,600 studies were screened. A lot of them were excluded at the title and abstract screening phase. Then there was a number of studies that were sought in terms of how to find the full text. They found all 66 articles, so those were assessed, and they excluded 61 articles, and they've provided exclusion reasons here as well. So you can see wrong outcome or wrong population, etc., in that box on the right. And then at the very bottom, you see how many studies were included. So only 5 out of the 4,786 results that they started off with were relevant in the context of this particular review. So that just gives you an example of how to develop a Prisma diagram. Also on the Prisma website, you will see information and templates that you can download and modify for your own review. So once the review is produced, then you want to disseminate its findings. And in order to do that, you can seek out different venues. Obviously, most reviews are published as journal articles. And sometimes to help increase the likelihood of your article being accepted, you can check out to see if a journal produces reviews. Not produces, but publishes reviews. Not all journals will, so you can run a few searches on journal websites to see if you can search within the journal for scoping reviews, see if that's a methodology that they publish. If not, maybe seeking another opportunity elsewhere that might be more prone to publish scoping reviews. You can also turn to or try to seek to support open access opportunities. So this isn't a presentation on open access, but as a librarian, we sort of want to make sure that you know a bit about open access. So you can target specifically green open access journals or hybrid journals that have open access options. So if you're not too familiar with what open access means, it's basically a different form of publication that allows access to scholarly research without a paywall barrier, so without a subscription. So anyone, anywhere, whether you have access through a university library or you're just sitting at home and want to have access to research, if you find open access research, it makes it more accessible. You can also decide to support open access by depositing a copy of your article or your review in our institutional repository. So we have a repository that provides open access to published research called UO Research. You can seek to support open access that way as well. Now, traditionally, we think of the end result of a review as being a published journal article, but obviously you can think of other ways of communicating that your results. So either through conference presentations, through poster presentations as well, but also through other channels such as social media, even providing or producing fact sheets for different policymakers or decision makers. Those could be important ways of making sure the results of your review are made available. So there was a lot of information in today's video on extracting data and presenting your final review. And some of the key points to remember is that, as I've mentioned throughout this series, a lot of the preparation work that you do at the beginning can help inform the different steps and simplify certain steps along the way. So planning for data extraction early on can help as well. Not only does that discussion help for this particular phase, but it also might inform how you select titles and abstracts and also how you evaluate the full text. Remember to test the data extraction form. A pilot test with 2 or 3 studies can help make sure that everyone's extracting the same information. There's no way that you will be exactly the same in terms of data extraction. Some of the simpler steps as well will be easy, but some of the harder ones might be trickier to have full consensus. So generally speaking, being aware that not everyone will extract the same level of information. That's just the reality of doing data extraction, but hopefully understanding that everyone's taking out the key pieces that should be found in order for the final review to come out. Returning again to the review questions, This idea also of producing a narrative and descriptive summary along the way, and remembering not only the review's questions, but also its goal. And the context not only of your particular review, but the goals of the scoping review methodology, stating the extent of the literature on a topic, identifying gaps for future research. Keep that in the back of your minds as you produce scoping reviews. And as I've said along the way, if you have questions, definitely consult with your librarian. We'll be more than happy to help you out along the different steps, including data extraction as well. So producing a scoping review is not something that will happen overnight. It's definitely a planned out process that will take time. It can vary, obviously, depending on resources available, but also in terms of the extent of the literature. If you start off with a search with 1,000 results, you might get a review done in a few months or even a few weeks if you're really focused and devoted to that project. But however, if you have more results, it could take several months and perhaps even several years. So being open to the fact that a scoping review is not a project that usually happens in a very quick time span. Hopefully this series helped you understand the nuances between scoping reviews and other review types, but also all the steps involved and the details required to fully and successfully complete a scoping review.